Hello, and welcome to the Project Good podcast. I'm your host, Anne Marie Hilton. Project Good is a social impact podcast interviewing experts and advocates about the pressing problems that we face globally and hearing how they suggest we move forward in the future. The Project Good podcast is brought to you by Project Good Work. The goal of this podcast is to inspire people and organizations to develop a mindset that can move others to positive action regarding the complex social issues facing people and the planet. For April, we're focusing on the searching for the truth on climate change. If you are lucky enough to go or follow the latest Conference of the Parties, or as they're referred to, COP26 and 27, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, you have been hearing alarming things about our planet's future in 2030 if we continue on our current path. Places, animals, and things that we were used to doing may not be available as they are now. Exactly how close are we to doomsday and being forced to live alternative lifestyles? It looms at the back of people's minds, but the truth is the problem seems overwhelming, leaving most of us with a hopeless feeling. But how much should we be leaning into those feelings? Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Mark Cortez, who's the author, entrepreneur, and longtime veteran of solar, electric vehicle, infrastructure, and energy storage industries. As one of the solar industry's early brand architects, he has been working on the front lines of the climate change industry for decades. He has raised over $20 million for multiple startups and is currently the founder and CEO of Liquid 8, a water conservation startup. Mr. Cortez is also a professor of entrepreneurship, technology, commercialization at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Mr. Cortez, through his latest book, Climate Maturity, asks readers to question what they know about climate change. Let's get into the interview. According to a number of reports on climate change, within the next 2 decades, global temperatures are likely to rise 1.5 degrees Celsius. The last 7 years have been the warmest on record. More than 1 million species are at risk of extinction by climate change. Climate change is already happening and is detrimental to human life. And worst of all, many leaders are not taking it seriously. Mark Cortez, who is the author of Climate Maturity, uses his book and years within the clean technology field to raise questions about what we all truly know about the state of our planet and what we need to do. In the book, he tells us not to get too emotional to the point that we cannot think clearly about what we should do and what we shouldn't do about the information that we've gathered. Today, we will be taking a look at the information we've been given and explore some real actions that we can take. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to have you here on this wonderful morning here. And so before we get into the interview, I always like to have a little bit of fun and get to know the guests. And so my question for you is, I wanted to know, how did you decide to get into this career of clean technology?
Yeah, I don't know that it was a clear decision. It's like most paths that you take. It's just sort of a small fork in the road, and you take that one step, and next thing you know, 10 years go by, and you're down a whole different road. So that's how it was for me. I spent years in my background is engineering. Spent years as an aerospace engineer, working actually on the space station program, the space station that's flying up there now, and always had an interest in had more of an interest in what you could actually do with the technology than the actual technology itself. And so I always gravitated towards sales and marketing of technology products, and started working towards commercializing new technologies as the former Soviet Union fell. And so there were all these companies over there that were making anything from bombs to refrigerators. And I spent 2 or 3 years going over there and trying to figure out how to commercialize some of the products that they actually had. And that sort of jump started me into the technology commercialization area. And when solar was originally booming back in about 2000, I managed to get a job with Shell at the time. Shell was in the energy business, the solar business, and took a job as director of product management for Shell and trying to help them decide what products that we should be offering here in the U.S. market. And then, as they say, the rest is history. It's been a long, crazy road. We call it the solar coaster when you're in the business because, wow, it's been exciting, but also lots of up and downs. So that's how I got into the energy business.
That's very cool. Yes, I know. Like, yeah, solar used to be. I guess I'm going to show my age a little bit, but I know when I was a younger kid, my family even had the solar panels on their roof for everything, and everything was being pushed to go. Have solar on your roof. Cut your water bills, cut this, cut that. So I know it used to be pushed on everyone a lot,
Yeah.
and now, of course, is being looked at again. I guess from even a different perspective, perhaps than just pushing it on the neighbors. So let's start talking about climate change. Of course, just saying the word climate change, it looms at everybody's mind. I'm sure if we just look at it as from just the word itself, it seems overwhelming because you're just one person on this planet of now 8 billion people. So most people are like, well, what can I do? And if the earth is warming and we can barely just manage our own little ourselves and our homes, so to think of a whole entire planet overwhelms people. So I guess we should start with the first question: is climate change actually real?
Yeah, climate change is real. I have never said, and it gets so political and it's such a hot button issue. Climate change is real. Look, the climate is always changing. It has always been changing. I think everyone accepts that. And certainly mankind's, our industrial revolution and us discovering and burning fossil fuels contributes to that. So it's certainly an influence. And there's no doubt that us burning a bunch of fossil fuels, continuing to do that is, and coupled with the fact that we now have 8 billion people on the planet, those are big factors that affect the Earth. So yes, we are. The climate is changing. It's always changing. It's going to continue to change, and we, as people, are having some influence on that.
Okay, yes, because yes, there is that. That's you answered the first thing that is on debate right now, is like, is
The
something is
denier,
really
or
happening.
yeah. And so, look, I think this is, part of why I set down this journey. Someone coming from the renewable energy industry, as I did, and now it's come so far to the other way, which is you sort of have to pick sides, right? You have to buy into this whole narrative of it's the climate apocalypse and we're all going to be dead by Thursday. Oops, today is Thursday, so maybe it's next Thursday. Or you're a complete denier, right? You're just completely close. It's like the Wizard of Oz. You close the curtains and pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And so, it's just ridiculous. And that's part of what inspired me to take this journey, because it's not an easy one when you decide to have a different opinion about the climate, especially that flies in the face of an industry that you helped build. I just advocate for a pragmatic and rational discussion down the middle, which is, we all know that that burning, no one's going to go and breathe in a tailpipe, right? Because it's bad
Mhm.
stuff. And so there's some logic, and then there's just the logic times 1,000 that turns into some hysteria. So you have to buy into one of these narratives. And I said, no, there's a better way. There's just a better way. We need to be having a realistic discussion. And I think what really drove it home for me is working with young adults that are entering the workforce. At Cal Poly, as I'm a professor there. Here we've got 22-year-olds who have heard their entire life. They've been hearing these messages of we're all going to die, and they literally are saying to themselves, "Well, maybe we shouldn't have kids because." The planet's going to be dead. So what's the point? And as someone who's helped start this industry, I sit there and I go, wait a sec, that is so not true. It's literally just complete fiction. And so I get it that that's the narrative. I get it that those are the stories that are out there. So I just couldn't help but feel that we have failed as an energy community, as a client community. If that's the message that 22-year-old adults are having as they enter the workforce, then that's just an epic fail. And so I felt motivated to try to dig into the truth, whatever truth there is, like real truth there is out there. Let's just try to dig into it and shine a light on that. And so that's what set me down on this journey, is to try to help that.
Yes, and so, you were talking about the two popular, mindsets, and, one of the things when I was, going through your book is that, I found that myself that I had, become siloed in my thinking as well, that, it was either, this way or that way, and, your book brought to light that there's sometimes an in between that we're missing. And, as you mentioned, there's the doomsday thinking, like, like, what's the point? Throw up our hands and
Right.
just like,
Right.
and cry and just, plan your next 8 years the best that you can. Because, that's I guess I should ask you too, because I'm sure you're familiar with the UN 2030 goals,
Yeah.
and then also that 2030 is kind of our marker of no return. Like if we don't start making improvements in these next 8 years here, is that by 2030, if we keep our heads in the sand, or we just say whatever, and continue that, we're, and at that point we're at the hopeless stage. um
Right. Yeah.
and so, and I know I would say, just based off what you're saying, that you feel that we have more time than 2030. Is that correct, or do you think that that's not necessarily true?
So, back in 1989, so I'll date myself a little bit. The first time I heard about the, climate and issues of that, it was probably before 1989, but really the IPCC was really just getting going back then, 1989. So back in 1989, there was 10 years to live. Okay. And then in 1999, there was 10 years to live. And then in 2000, there's 10 years to live. So we're now into the fifth decade of, hey, only, the countdown till tipping point. So, um, come on. I mean, it is a story, it's a narrative.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that well, if you spend some time, let's talk about the IPCC a little bit. They're the United Nations, right? They are a political group. They're not scientists. There are scientists who contribute their reports to that report, to their findings, but they are a worldwide group of political analysts that number in the thousands. Okay, so their job is to frame science for their own political consumption. So they aren't. Whereas back when this started, they had a charter to be impartial and not be advocates. That has changed dramatically. So starting in about 2014, and I actually have charts that show. The IPCC, the way that they do this is they create scenarios. So, scenario planning is just a tried and true way of literally just taking a blank spreadsheet and say, hey, what if all these different things happened? Let's lay out a bunch of scenarios. And then what if we make a bunch of assumptions of things? And then let's plug in some things that we actually know, like, temperatures that we've measured over the past 20 years and actual science that we can measure. Let's plug all of those things into scenario, hit enter, and see what happens. And so what the result is this scatter shot of just a whole bunch of different scenarios. There's 45 different scenario classes that the IPCC has gathered. And within those scenario classes are, I think it's 1,143 different scenarios, and they are all made up. So let's just, I always remind myself and everyone that all of the scenarios that we're looking at, they are all made up scenarios. These are scenarios that have been crafted to help us try to project into the future. They're all forward-looking guesses. So there's 1,100, and they all go through these very sophisticated models. And so what ends up is this big scattershot piece of information that is, hey, look at all of the things that could potentially happen. Assuming all of these different variables. So you're taking into account temperature measurements from the past, you're projecting those forward. You're trying to guess how the globe, the planet, the physical planet is going to react to more people, more energy, different energy mixes, different growth patterns, different population migration. So just try to think about how complex that is, and it is literally an exercise in trying to predict the future. So I always remind myself and everyone about that, because the idea that we have 10 years to live is a fabrication. It's just fiction. And so of those 1,100 different scenarios, pick one, all right? Look at those and say, which one do you think that you want to create a story about? So, what has unfortunately happened, and what I pick on in my book, is the most extreme scenario is called RCP, Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5, which just takes the worst of everything that's happened in the past and projects that forward into the future. So it's called RCP 8.5. So people have chosen to communicate that as the baseline. And you can chart how much it gets um, communicated in the different IPCC reports. So over the past 25, 30 years, you can see that that scenario, whereas when it started, all the scenarios were created equal, by 2014 and certainly by 2022, the most extreme scenario is now front and center. And so it gets mentioned like 60% of the time as this is what's going to happen, except that there's nothing backing that. There is absolutely no science. There's no probability theory. It's just a narrative that people chose. So what happens with that? So you feed that to the media, and what does the media do? They have their own stories and their own positions on things. So you spoon feed that to the New York Times. Guess what happens? The headline says we've got 8 years to live, and of course politicians, that feeds right into them because they want the money for it. As we just saw in Egypt last week with COP27, what came out of that? Hey, guess what? The big international climate reparations fund that is going to be funded by the US and China and all of us, right? So the money, it's follow the money. So that's the story. So 8 years to live? No, that's absolutely ridiculous. And there is zero science, and I'll say zero science that leads us there. So that's unfortunately one of the challenges with climate change is there's a bunch of stuff we know, and then we've projected a bunch of that stuff forward. And then unfortunately, scientists and the scientific community has strayed into this area of advocacy. And so they now take their own science and form opinions about what that science should mean and what it should mean to us. And they communicate that. And that's a big part of what's happening in all of these doomsday reports is you have scientists who personally believe that we're headed a certain direction, but their science doesn't prove it. And that's the challenge that we have in trying to find this truth. I was expecting to find smoking guns, and all I found was fog. Honestly, I think the deeper I dug into it, the cloudier this became, and so that was an eye opener for me.
Yes, and I guess the question to that is there a way for us to find the truth, do you believe?
Well, I think part of it is continuing to peel back the onion. Part of it is, and the reason I'm doing this exact thing is, we got to be able to talk about this. I can't tell you how many times when I raise my hand, and again, part of why I wrote this book was I've been raising my hand for 15 years. But when you're in the solar industry, you're not allowed to raise your hand. You just have to you have to go out there and you have to say, yes, solar is the answer to everything, right? It's just like everything. You have to say it, or else you get kind of blackballed in a lot of ways, and you certainly get pressured to not say stuff like that. So um, part of it is peel back. Don't stop at the media. If you read the New York Times, you're going to get a very clear narrative. Oppositely, if you read the Fox News, you're going to get a very different narrative. So my suggestion is read both. Read as much as you can from both, and just try to sort through that, because what you're going to find as you read most of these narratives are look for the qualifiers, right? Because qualifiers are if, could, might, maybe, potential, projected, right? Those are all words that describe guesses. So, so
Mhm.
as you train yourself to go through the stories, I would just say start looking at when you read these stories. Put that lens on and say, if a story is saying, if this bad stuff happens in 20 years, it's projected that we're all dead. Put up the red flag. Read it with that lens, because most of what you're reading are just projections of that. So those are a couple of things, and then be willing to just sort of ask questions about it. We need We need scientists to be scientists. We need them to prove stuff. We need them to explain to us the difference between looking backwards and measuring stuff and then looking forwards and guessing at stuff. Yes, they're sophisticated models, awesome, but here's what no one tells you. The models are wrong every single time. Every single time. So they're wrong all the time, and yet we're expected to spend trillions of dollars and in some cases reverse global economies for models that are wrong continually. I mean, continually. So, man, that's a pretty tough one. And so I think part of what happens is we need to be raising our hands and sort of calling BS on a lot of this stuff. Things that don't make sense, they don't make sense. And we need to be able to say that without fear of getting 100 arrows shot at you. We need scientists to be scientists. I appreciate that they feel strongly about stuff, but the idea of science advocacy, where scientists prove stuff and then mix that with their own opinions, and they think that that's okay. It's not okay, and unfortunately, that is pervasive throughout the climate community. And there's something that they call now a replication crisis, which is you can't replicate if someone in Alabama does a climate study, someone in Italy can't replicate it. They can't replicate the results. So that's a crisis. It's a legitimate crisis if you have these models that are guessing at things that you can't reproduce everywhere. It calls into question the entire foundation of the argument. So I think we know a lot more than we did 30 years ago in terms of the science, but the amount of stuff we don't know is still astronomical. And so, again, when we say we've got 8 years to do stuff, there's no basis for that. There's just no basis for that. Those are political and media constructs.
Now, one of the things, since climate change is real,
Yeah,
then, and we see that, there's a rising in temperatures. And I'm gonna play a little, I don't know if it's devil's advocate really, but
sure.
one of the things is that, and this is kind of a scenario I will say that my parents used to play on me is like give you the worst case. This is what's going to happen, to make you start taking action so you don't get to a crisis point. So could it be, I guess, that the different entities are playing up the worst case scenario so that it makes people take some action, even if it is minimal, because it is an overwhelming problem that obviously not one person can solve. Do you think perhaps that's why they go to the doomsday? I understand what you're saying about the money factor and the political factor, but is it also possibly to our benefit to think about, okay, if we don't, if we keep kicking the ball or the kicking the can down the road, of course, it's only getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Do you think that it's more dangerous to have like saying like, okay, if we don't do something, guys, we're washing away, or catastrophes are going to start happening? Do you think that it's too dangerous to tell people, I guess, the worst case scenario because it actually leads to people not taking any action at all because they're overwhelmed?
Well, I think that's what's happened now, right? I
Mhm,
think people are overwhelmed.
mhm,
If you ask someone today, hey, what are you doing about the climate? Watch the look on their face, right? They'll just lock up. Right. So
mhm.
I think that exact scenario has happened because of climate panic. I think it is so scary and so big, and you feel so helpless that no one has any idea what to do. So I think that we're there. I don't think that, and it's a direct result of this strategy of communicating and promoting. And look, I have found the blueprints for these. Right, Columbia University created the template for how to castigate people who don't believe what they believe. It's shocking. On one hand, it's shocking. On the other hand, it makes perfect sense because this is exactly what you're reading. They tell you very clearly, here are the words to use to describe someone who doesn't believe in climate change. Use these words, and it actually sends some chills up my spine because I think to myself, wow, the only other denier construct I can think of is when people deny the Holocaust, right? And think
Mhm.
of the emotions I mean, this is intentional, right? So this is not conspiracy theory. There's an actual strategy for how to do this. So we're there. we have reached the goal of that, and that we've scared the hell out of everyone. Thank you very much. Now what? But and look, Al Gore, for whatever he did with his movies, he was very clear about this. I in my book, I have the quote of what he said, that he believes it's fine to misrepresent the importance of it in order to get people to move. And his partner in crime, the scientist Dr. Stephen Schneider, has passed on, but from Stanford, they both won the Nobel Prize as teammates for this. But Dr. Schneider, there was a phrase he used. He called it a double ethical bind, and he set a new form of science advocacy. So the double ethical bind was, on one hand, there's science that proves stuff. On the other hand, there's what I believe about that science. And hopefully they're the same thing. But if they're not, who gives a damn? If it's important enough, the lie is fine. And when science, and we gave him a Nobel Prize for that. So when the two guys that have won Nobel Prize for this sort of advocacy, when they both are standing out there saying, I know I've exaggerated it, but it's important enough, then you gotta put up the white flag and say, no, this is wrong. So look, we're at the end of this first 25 years. We've seen the damage it causes. Part of why it's overwhelming is because the solutions that are out there are hugely expensive, and they equate to basically spinning the earth backwards on its axis. So what are you going to do tonight to go help that? Anything? Right? It's so overwhelming so no one knows what to do. So we end up just sort of locking up and saying, well, let's hope that these big international conferences can come up with some exotic international sounding piece of paper that will finally, after 30, 40 years, help solve this problem, which of course it doesn't. It's just more political theater. So is there value to communicating the worst case? To some extent. But when you start putting numbers to the worst case scenario, I'll give you an example. Is it worth you personally to spend $10,000 to $20,000 of your income every single year for the rest of your life to solve it? Is it that important? And I suspect for 99% of the people, that answer is a big no. The problem is no one tells you that number. You kind of have to back into it. So I've done some of the math, and I'm like, it's an astronomical number to completely decarbonize the grid, do all these things that they're talking about. I mean, you're talking multiples of global GDP type numbers, and so it's a pretty dramatic thing. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think we have seen the results of decades of climate panic, and they're not good. Awareness is great. Scared children, a scared generation of children, and a total feeling of climate helplessness. Those are terrible outcomes. There's just no other way to say it. Those are awful. They lead us into complete paralysis.
Yes. Yes, and I understand where you're coming from, and it makes me think of two questions to ask. Um, you know, are there things that we can do to make progress to fix the climate without ruining our way of life? One of the things that this is from a different episode, and we talked about the push for recycling and things like that. But then once I dove into listening to the expert that I had on, it seemed that recycling was like barely going to make a dent.
Yeah.
So I don't know, are there things that we can do that won't ruin our way of life? Because the things like you've mentioned before, they're extreme. And so
Right.
I start thinking about all those sci-fi movies that I've seen, and I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready for that yet.
Right. Well, what lead when we have extreme emotions about stuff, it leads you to extreme reactions, and so part of what I've been pushing back on is the extreme solutions that are being proposed out there. Right. So I come from the solar industry, and so all of a sudden, solar is the answer to the world's problems, and I'm like, wait, what? Um, it works, when it works, and it works for, I think when we model solar systems, I think we model it working from, 5 hours a day. So then what are we going to do for the rest of the 19 hours, right? We're going to sit in the dark. So I mean, these are reality. What, windmills are modeled for about 40% usage. So what do you do for the other 60%? You need other stuff. So right. So and then people go, oh well, it's EVs. Well, the fact is, off of the assembly line, an EV has a much higher carbon footprint than an internal combustion engine, and it only catches up depending on how you drive and where you live and where you charge it. And if you have long range batteries, you may never catch up. It's actually so each one of these, I keep looking at this. Our climate problem is a consumption problem. That's just let's bottom line it. Our climate problem is we're just using too much stuff and
Mhm.
discarding it, right? So that TV that I could potentially repair, you know what? Best Buy's having an awesome sale on a 50-inch Samsung TV, $189. Do I really want to spend a Saturday fixing this TV? I could just go buy one. What the heck? Right. Well,
Mhm.
so all of all of the policies that we have just encourage more consumption. So we're trying to solve our overconsumption problem with more consumption. So all of this, the new bill that just came out, the Inflation Reduction Act, it's just billions for more solar, more windmill, more EVs, more electric charging. If you install a solar panel on your roof today, you've added CO2. It never gets below that. You're comparing yourself against potentially avoiding worse emissions in the future, but it never gets better. It just gets less worse. And those are very big differences. So we're trying to solve our consumption problem with more consumption, and it just logically doesn't even make sense. So, unfortunately, people don't like to hear this. The best thing that happened to the climate game in the past 30 years was COVID. In one
Mhm.
year, we had our emissions dropped by 11% in the US, 11% in 12 months. We did in one year what 30 years of climate policy haven't been able to do. Think about that, right? And why? Because we just did less stuff. Hey, we worked less. We didn't drive as much. We didn't go to the office as much. So, how come no one's saying that? Could you imagine a national policy that says, hey, we've decided that all offices are closed on Friday. You're going to telecommute. You just save 20%, right? But that kind of stuff never even gets. It's never even discussed, And so which is just shocking to me. I mean, these are freebies. These are freebies. We've made more progress in one year than 30 years of consumptive spending haven't been able to do. So why do we want more of it? And that's part of my premise. So consumption, or reducing consumption, carbon removal. If carbon is the enemy, all of the solutions that we're promoting are adding carbon. So things like trees, natural farming, all of these dozens and hundreds of natural ways to sequester carbon. Imagine every national park in the US being a nationally protected carbon sink. That is protected. We don't touch the trees. Their job is to suck up carbon and remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Okay, so there's all those types of things. And then there's carbon removal technologies that are in their very early stages, don't make much economic sense now. But if the goal is to remove CO2 from the air, why are we driving a Tesla? Why aren't we trying to develop and commercialize these big carbon removal technologies that still have a long way to go, but actually are built to lower carbon? And then last but not least, everyone hates this word, but adaptation, right? I mean, the truth is we adapt. Humans adapt. We're always going to adapt. The Himalayas are not going to melt tomorrow. Uh, we've got a 30-year head start if the Himalayas start to decline in their ice. So there's not going to be like 2 billion people sitting on the top of Mount Everest that all of a sudden there's a big, glacier that melts and sends those 2 billion people into the abyss. Again, fantasy, right?
Mhm.
It's just not going to happen. So the best example I have is New Orleans. Back in 2007, Hurricane Katrina, right? Category
Mhm.
4. I personally was there in the recovery aspect when we built solar homes for people in the lower Ninth Ward. We donated a bunch of solar systems to help them get back onto the grid. So I personally witnessed all of that stuff. And, the levees broke for the hurricane. And so we realized that it was through our own mess that we didn't handle what nature came at us. So here we are, 2021. Hurricane Ida comes through New Orleans, another category 4 hurricane, and the death count was a tenth of what it was with Katrina because we fixed the levees, we adapted. So New Orleans, rather than try to spin the earth backwards and globally cool the planet, they just fixed their levees. They adapted and it worked. It saved people. And so if we're worried about coastal flooding, then why are we approving all of the permits to let people build right on the shore? Let's move them a mile inland and we'll save all that. So there's a lot of things that we can do that just make common sense that, you're not going to go build your house on a floodplain if you know that once every 7 weeks that you're going to be flooded. You're not going to do that. So you adapt. We adapt to all those things. And our history has been full of that, of us adapting to new challenges with the planet, new constraints and things like that.
Yes, you brought up a whole different point that, you know, kind of was already sitting on the surface, but it brings to light, I guess, each individual in the fact that you were saying our climate problem is really a consumption problem.
Yeah.
And when I was looking at that and thinking through that, and even and I'm sure you've seen this, especially because you are here in California, as I am. California, of course, is known for being a little eccentric more than maybe other places in the U.S. And we are
Yeah.
into our green juices, and we like to think of ourselves as the healthy people out here.
Right. Of course.
But we also, we're also those types of people that are like, oh, here's this bag that's going to do 1% for the ocean, or let me go buy my water bottle that is made out of recycled coconut or something like that. And we keep
Right.
doing those things, and we use it to showcase to people that and look at me, I'm more eco-conscious than you are, but we are still buying these things that we don't necessarily need. Um,
Yeah.
and so, and that also goes with a previous episode that I had called the plastic crisis, right? So almost
Yeah.
everything we have is made out of plastic these days, right? All
Yeah.
of us are working on these computers, which are plastic, and then once we either find it either breaks or we need to go get a new model because we need the latest, the greatest, then we just throw it in the pile.
Yeah.
And yes, you brought up a very key point that I think a lot of people, they don't want to face, right? Because everybody is turned into kind of, I guess, this lack of better terms, like a spoiled child.
Yeah, but we don't call ourselves that, right? We we,
Right.
we call ourselves eco warriors
Yes.
or
Yes.
something
And
like that. We use the word justice a lot, right? Eco justice and stuff like that.
yes, but yeah, but you bring up a point I think that is staring us right in our face, that if we really want to solve the problem, we have to look at how we are interacting ourselves with the earth and with ourselves, of like, why do we need to, project an image instead of actually doing something? And I think we are in this era, obviously, with social media and everything, of projection, right? Instead of
Yeah.
actually facing our demons and ourselves, and doing something. And when you said that, I was like, haha, it was almost like a key. I was like, we could easily solve it, just stop everyone. And yes,
Well, we did, and we did, right? We showed
right,
him.
and this leads me to talk about the pandemic, because I did read articles about how the air was cleaner, how animals were like feeling like they could
Yeah.
walk around again, and they were
Exactly.
like, okay, there's space for us again, and the grass was coming back, and flowers were like blooming better than they were before, because we didn't have all this pollution that was going on because we weren't driving our cars because we had nowhere to go.
Yeah.
Um, so that the pandemic, I believe, is obviously has been life changing for everyone on the planet in all different ways, but it was definitely, I would say, a wake up call. And it should be a major wake up call to this, this climate change problem, that we should look at, like, well, look, look at that. It's us, not it's really us, like, and how we're approaching our lives, and that we should actually be relieved and say we're doing too much. We're doing too much.
Yeah, and and I take that same, if you have that
Mhm,
realization, then this whole argument why that, I keep reading articles that say, 11 companies are responsible for 70% of all the emissions, right? So it's
mhm,
basically a target on oil companies' back. Um, right, but that's just so not true because it's not like they and the idea is, well, if we just stop those 11 companies, then we've solved 70% of the problem. And it's just again, it's just data manipulation, right? Because oil companies make stuff that we use. So
mhm.
they're just like Facebook, they're just like Twitter. And so if you want to get back at oil companies, stop using their stuff. And so this is another of my messages when I have this conversation a bunch. We gotta get rid of fossil fuels, and I say, great, you first. So here, let me just explain what that means. That means you're not wearing your clothes, you're not living in a house, you're not driving any car or taking any sort of public transportation or any transportation. You don't have indoor plumbing, food, right? Let's just go through the list. You're here because of oil and gas. I'm not an oil and gas guy, but let's just, the reality of the situation is if you're standing up and saying, um, we got to get rid of fossil fuels tomorrow. You first, right? Go ahead, go for it. Take your family, sell all your stuff, give up your clothes, go live in a yurt up on top of Pikes Peak, and go for it. It's entirely within your right. You will have saved your family. But of course, no one does that, right? Joe Biden looks at the camera and says, flies, he gets in Air Force One, flies over to Glasgow, stares into the camera and says, we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, then flies back, right? How many tons of CO2 did he emit? So, it's just we're to the point of ridiculousness with a lot of this stuff. We're not getting rid of fossil fuels. We know it's got a bad side, but it's also, every one of us, certainly in this country, has been lifted up by the benefits of oil and gas. It's just a fact. The fact that you and I are talking right now, the fact that all of us have lives are enabled by oil and gas. So any policy that just chooses to ignore that is just fiction, right? It's just you can't make any solar panels without oil and gas. I worked for solar companies, right? The first step in manufacturing that process is to fire up a big tractor and mow down a mountain and, and start sorting through dirt to get all the minerals. There's nothing clean about that. So we can call it whatever we want. It's just not the reality of it. So to your point where you're saying, yeah, it's all us. Well, if you shut down all the oil companies, okay, they go out of business. But hey, guess what? We're back to living in caves, and that's just the fact. We can't. There's just no path around that. So I would love to have an energy policy or just to have that on the table as we describe stuff as opposed to just demonizing and oil shaming. Right now, you like you said, you feel bad. Everyone's driving their Tesla, and I'm looking at them going, okay, first of all, there's $30,000 of public money in your car. You're welcome. And second of all, you just made the problem so much worse because a Tesla coming off an assembly line is way worse than my 10-year-old Subaru in terms of CO2. So it's just nonsense. It's just green signaling, virtue signaling, and we're making so little progress.
Now, I have, I guess, two questions. I'm first going to ask for a definition type of question, just because it is something that comes up, and I think a lot of people may or may not know what it means. I wanted to ask what exactly, because we're always talking about carbon. So
Yeah.
let's explain to people about the carbon footprint and how is it measured and what the heck is it?
Carbon is code for CO2 levels. Okay, so it's what you emit, what gets emitted. CO2 gets emitted from just day to day living. So when every and when you create energy of any source, you create byproducts, and CO2 is a byproduct. So if you burn coal, for example, you create a lot of CO2. If you burn natural gas, you create a lot of CO2. But if you install solar and you build solar panels, you're creating some amount of CO2. So There is a narrative out there that talks about zero carbon energy, and that's just that's factually a fiction. It's a made up term, and I know because I helped commercialize this stuff. And what they do is they just say, well, once it's all made and once it's all installed, and then it's actually producing electricity out in the field, it doesn't emit anything. So if you choose what you're going to ignore, then so many other things could be made to look comparatively better. Um, so it's the idea of everything. Every energy source has byproducts, and the byproducts are not usually good. So everything you burn, every energy source, if you go on and turn on a light, no matter the source that is coming from, CO2 is being emitted somewhere. Same with your cars. If you're driving your car, you're emitting lots of CO2 if you're spitting out fossil fuels. But if you have an electric car, that car was built in factories, that was built, using lithium, and all that stuff was mined. And so that electric car that's bright and shiny and looks clean, and when you drive it, it's quiet and it doesn't emit anything as you drive it. But when it shows up on your driveway, it's already emitted a lot just to make it. Okay. And then when you plug it in, some energy source somewhere is emitting CO2. So, you're dirtying something somewhere just by charging it. And it varies by neighborhood. It varies by the hour, by the second. It varies. Did that help?
Yes, yes, that's good. I just think it's important for people to understand the carbon footprint because it is something that is, thrown around a lot in the climate change discussions. And so I think it's important for people to understand that. And because we were talking about businesses, we were looking at oil, and I'm sure you're familiar with the whole B Corp
Yeah.
scenarios and things like that. Should we, I guess, hold industries and business accountable for climate change, or should we lay off of them? Because right now, as you see in the public, that everybody has a magnifying glass on all different businesses.
Yeah, so I believe so. I think the good side of all this climate panic, if there is such a thing, is awareness. Awareness is fantastic. So 30 years into this, we're way smarter and way more transparent about what we're looking for. We now expect businesses to have some sustainability efforts in place. So, how do you do that? And how do you hold them accountable? And there are different approaches, similar to what we're doing with energy, the carrot and stick approach, right? So, the stick approach is I'm going to penalize you if you're bad, right? That the stick approach uses regulation. All right, I'm going to decide how much that company down the street can emit. If they go above that, I'm going to slap them hard with penalties. That's one approach. Another approach is just like I said with Facebook. You know what? If you don't like what they're doing, if they're spitting bad stuff into the river, quit buying their stuff. Get all your neighbors to quit buying your stuff. Use social media to say, you know what? These guys are bad. I watch them do bad stuff. Right? Let's make there be a market penalty for what they do, until they fix it. And that stuff is powerful. And look at all the ESG efforts that are now starting to go away because we tried to give them penalties and we're realizing, well, maybe that just doesn't work. But there's ways to do it. Timberland has been a good example of a company that are doing lots of things on their own initiatives, just to help their brand and to help their public perception of how things are done. And so Microsoft, I applaud Microsoft from their climate perspective because they're one of the few companies that said, hey, guess what? It's not enough to zero out my emissions because emissions are just what I'm going to spit out into the air tomorrow. Even if I zero that out, I've still done a lot of damage. So their goal is, hey, we're gonna remove all of the carbon we've emitted since 1975. So that puts them at the top of my list. I look at that and I go, okay, that's a commitment. Emissions reductions or zero emissions that are going to take 30 years or 50 years. Come on, that's just virtue signaling. But someone who says, "Hey, I'm going to repair all the damage I've done since I've been alive," that's a whole different ballgame. So I think that there's ways to do it. I think that if we don't like, when I didn't like Facebook, and I don't like Facebook, I got off the platform. To hell with them. Sorry, sorry for my language. Right? With Twitter, same thing. So if we don't like, and I say the same thing about oil and gas. Boy, if you really don't like it, quit using their stuff. Just evolve today. Quit using their stuff. We have so much power as individuals. The markets speak so clearly and so directly. If we don't want something, it goes away. And so if companies are bad polluters and they have a bad public record on sustainability, stop using their stuff. There's plenty of alternatives. There are very few companies out there that have monopolies that you can't find substitutes for. I even with Amazon, I'm to the point now where, they're just so big and so monopolistic. I'm like, you know what? I'll go and spend 10, 20% more just so I can go down and support my local store because, having something that gets, that gets forwarded to my doorstep within 4 hours of me ordering it is just spewing CO2 all down the supply chain, right? There's lots of smoke coming out of all of those smokestacks.
Hmm. Yes. And so, yeah, it keeps coming back to like, in my mind, because I think in pictures, I keep just imagining all the ways that we are, not maybe consciously thinking about how we consume and how we are ourselves contributing to this problem. So how do you think that
Yeah.
we need to as just an everyday person, how do they need to think differently now and in the future about climate change?
Well, I think first and foremost is like what we've said. It's a consumption problem. Okay,
Hmm.
so as you had an aha moment, it was kind of that way for me too. It's like, well, maybe I don't need to throw out this TV. Maybe I don't need the new gadget this Christmas. As I'm buying electronics for my kids, I'm also cringing a little bit, going, "Dang, that is produced in China, and they're pouring sludge into some man-made lake out there." So an awareness of that and the way that this works is a really powerful thing because it affects your choices. Hey, maybe I don't need to go to the store 5 times a day to buy a nut on for a screw or something like that. You know what I mean? Just all of these decisions. Maybe I'll just wait and do it once over the weekend. Um, spending lots of time driving and flying and doing all that kind of stuff. We're in control of all of that kind of stuff. Maybe it's easier, instead of COP27 having hundreds and thousands of planes flying to Europe, maybe COP28 happens on Zoom. What a great idea. Think of all the emissions we avoid, right? Stuff like that. I mean, I'm just absolutely flabbergasted when I see these people up there with their microphones. I'm like, the carbon footprint of that event was phenomenal, right? And it takes a lot of fossil fuels to fly to a conference to hate on fossil fuels. So it's so ironic to me. So having that awareness, but I think also it's important to understand that what you're reading in the newspapers, these are not scientists writing stuff. These are narratives, they're stories, they're crafted. They are not based on facts. I talked about the scenarios. There's nothing wrong with scenarios. Scenarios help us understand the world. They have tremendous value. But to assume that forward projecting scenarios are scientific fact, that our future is scientifically determined already, no, just tell yourself no. That is just not true. Even when you really focus, even Steven Schneider, the guy who started this whole science advocacy, when he was pressed to the canvas on this and say, "Well, can you prove it?" And he says, "No, they want me to prove stuff. Of course I can't prove stuff." And I just remember thinking, yeah, we expect scientists to prove stuff. That's why we have them. Otherwise, you're me. Right? Otherwise, you're just someone with an opinion. So I would just say, kind of go through the media, but train yourself to look for the qualifiers, the ifs, the shoulds, the mays, projected to be, all of that stuff. Those are just guesses. They're just stories. Someone somewhere made up that scenario, and then he had some other peers that looked at that and they go, well, it could happen, but none of it says it's going to happen. And so I think those are very realistic things. And so think hard. I'm in the middle of. I mentioned my 10-year-old Subaru. This is a very real thing. I'm like, am I going to buy an electric car because it's such a thing? And I'm like, I bet I can make this car last for another 2 years just because I'll delay consumption. Right? I'll help
Hmm.
the planet by not encouraging more and more consumption. What's happened in the EV market is cars are getting bigger now. Now people, the percentage is shifting over to big old trucks, which
Mhm.
are just have a bigger, and why? Because the trucks get the bigger rebates. We're encouraging people to consume. So smarter consumerism, we're not going without, but maybe you don't replace that TV. Maybe you fix your bike. Maybe you make things last a little bit longer. Maybe you just don't drive as much, or maybe you don't fly as much, or maybe you do. Maybe your company institutes a 4-day work week where the fifth day is everyone on Zoom. It can work. We know that it can work, right? And things like that, we're all in control of. And it all makes things incrementally better. Don't cut down the trees in your backyard, or maybe you decide to replace the lawn with some xeriscape that you don't have to water, stuff like that.
Yes, and the two words that keep popping in my mind when you say this thing, say what you're saying is like we have to learn to have a global mindset
Yeah,
and have some gratitude. I think that's missing. I think that those are the things that keep popping into my mind. Those are the words that keep coming up. Is that I think that is what is driving this a little bit. It's a little bit deeper than we think. It's not just the temperature rising and we have pollution and destruction. It's a deeper, it's inner work that we all have to do, is that we have to realize that we are all connected, and that I think that we've lost the thing of being grateful. That's what I keep thinking. Those are the words that keep popping up when you're
that's a
saying
good
what you're
word.
saying.
Yeah, it's
And
a
I
good word. It's
Yeah,
yeah.
'cause things are usually deeper than, what they appear on the surface, and what you've said, that's what it's made me realize, that that's what we really need in order to start working on this problem, which is, those 2 things alone, having a global mindset and thinking about that we're connected in such a divisive time, and gratitude, which I think is maybe a shocking word for people. Gratitude and responsibility.
Yeah,
Yes,
look, I
yes,
mean,
yes.
oil and gas is
Mhm,
maybe, it's got a lot of downsides, but it
mhm,
also lifted civilizations out of poverty. So to deny other nations access to it, to me, is an act of aggression. How can we
mhm,
do that? How can we possibly deny them the same fuel, cheap fuel that lifted our entire civilization out of poverty? It's madness. It's just I don't even, it doesn't even make sense to me.
mhm, yes. And so I just have 2 more questions for you.
Of
And
course.
so, I wanted to know, when you were writing your book, Climate Maturity, what did you hope, to inspire people to do?
Yeah, honestly, I hope to inspire people to do exactly what we're doing, to talk. Um, Because as long as I've been in this business, there's been almost no dialogue. There's no dialogue. It's just monologues, right? It's one side yelling at the other, pointing fingers. And this leads me to my second point, which is, and I believe this. This needs to be bipartisan. Right now, and unfortunately, energy and climate policy is a political thing. It's a political hot button, and I'll just say it: it's a Democrat thing. It just is. But half of the world isn't, and half of the country isn't, and half, we're failing with global climate policy, not because of style and communications. We're failing because half of the world doesn't want it. Developing nations want nothing to do with it. Developing nations want oil and gas. Give it to us. Give it to us cheap. Don't show up with carbon credits and solar panels. I'll kick you out, right? That's so it's ludicrous, but half of our own country doesn't want it, and just doesn't want it. I mean, they're think about Iowa, right? You think Iowa farmers who are driving combines, and you show up with a solar panel and Tesla, what are they going to say? Are they going to say welcome? They're going to say, great, drive that down to the gas station and bring me some fuel for my combine. So my view is we don't make significant progress unless it's bipartisan. And when I mean that, I don't mean hey, congratulations, you had a conquest vote from the other side, like Joe Manchin. I mean, both sides can stand up proudly and say, you know what, we're doing this thing together, uh, and we mean this. They can all go back to their respective districts and brag about this, and not feel like they're getting attacked for it. And so maybe that's a little bit of nirvana, I guess. But I just look at what's happened, and it's just the pendulum going side to side. And we drink heartily when the money comes in, and then we button up the hatches when the money dries up, and it just the political pendulum swings back and forth, and we make no true progress. So I believe that that's to be the case. So yeah. So did that answer your question? Maybe that
Yes,
veered
yes,
off a
yes.
little
Yeah,
bit.
that gives me an idea of, yeah, I just wanted to know because, when writing a book, of course, is never an easy task. And so, I always like to know what drives people to create the book, if they, of course, weren't being forced to by an agent or something like that. But when they have something that they're passionate about, as you are very passionate about this topic, it's always interesting to find out, what was going on in your mind as you were developing this book. Mhm.
I to really get at the core of it, I have a very finely tuned, I'll be nice about it, untruth detector. And so, as I have progressed in the industry, and it's really been about the past 8 years, man, that's just been firing on all cylinders. I read stuff that I know is not true. I know it based on my own experience, or I read most of the stuff I read. I just raise my hand and go, "This doesn't make sense to me." And so I'm searching for the truth. I don't want that to sound high-minded. I called my book "The Muddy Climate Middle" because this is a slog. This is not easy. Trying to sort through science when I am not a climate scientist. I am an engineer and I have some technical background, and I teach it, but I don't do primary climate research. I'm a consumer like everyone else is, and I'm trying to figure out. All right, is this science that proves stuff, or is this just a scientist who has a very high opinion of his or herself that has done some science and has extrapolated climate death out of that? It's really difficult. So part of it is I feel an obligation to my own children, to the children I've taught, and the young adults that are entering the workforce is go find the truth. We haven't found it with the climate. And so I'm digging for it. I suggest to everyone, go dig for it. What you're reading in the papers is not the truth. And the truth is elusive. It's evolving continually. We are learning more every day. And so that's what inspires me, is to find the truth. What's the nugget of truth? Where is the actual reality of this? Everyone that says that there's an emergency, but no one's driving to the emergency room. What's wrong with this picture? So
Mhm.
that's what inspires me.
Yes, I like that. Like, like I said, when I read your book, I was like, because I had been one of those siloed individuals that had gotten drawn in, and then it made me start questioning things, and I was like, yeah, that's right, because I tend to be a pretty practical and common sense thinker. I like to think. I know that common sense isn't that common, but I would like to think that I have a good dose of it most of the time. That yeah, you really got me to start thinking and questioning, like, everything that I've been seeing that's been pushed. So this leads me to then, for people, and everybody, of course, is overwhelmed with thinking about this topic, because when we think, here we are, like, pretty much like we're an ant on a huge big planet.
Right.
So
Sure.
when we think about, here we're these itty little people on this large planet that is having a crisis. Should we feel hopeful for the future when it comes to discussing climate change?
Absolutely. Absolutely hopeful. I think you're starting to see the sea change a bit. So, and it's happened actually relatively recently in the past few months. So, remember these apocalyptic scenarios I told you about, where it just projects it upward and upward and upward to the right. Some scientists have revised a lot of their projections based on real world data up to 2020. And now, landmark for me is, a month ago, an article in the New York Times said, hey, maybe the future isn't going to be as bad as we all thought. That to me is an earthquake, right? When you starting to see that. So logic is starting to creep into this discussion. So I think years of scaring the hell out of everyone we're seeing it, right? You know what? We're just so scared. We're immobile at this point. We're just paralyzed. So it's not helping. So we're starting to see this level of thinking and just pragmatism. People saying, I know everyone I know cares about the climate. I don't know one person who just goes, I'm just going to go out and burn oil in my front yard. I don't know one person, right? So everyone cares about the planet. Let's start with that. We all are in this together. We know this. I don't know of anyone who's just going to flagrantly abuse it. And so we're all making better choices. We're all doing this. And so just to have a better, you're starting to see the narratives start to get tempered a little bit more. We're starting to, with the frustration that just came out of COP27, which is they didn't make any new commitments. Everyone's realizing that all the old ones are invalid because they're just pieces of paper. And the only thing they decided upon was to generate a big fund where we can start paying people reparations right now. We're starting to really question about, is it really going to be possible to spin the earth backwards? And, it's just, we're realizing that that's just a bit of just craziness. And so you're starting to see it. So I think it's super hopeful. I think the more conversations we have about this, where all of us are just going, there's options. We can choose to use less. We can choose our paths, every single one of us, that doesn't require us to give up our entire way of life. And I think once you have that realization, like you said, it's a consumption problem. You mean I just use less stuff? And it's not hard. It's really not hard to do that. Once you do that, chances are you're probably already doing it. Chances are you're going home and turning off lights, turning off water. We in California, we conserve where we can anyway. So we're making a lot of these choices already. So I'm very hopeful. I think that just having open conversations like we're doing, being willing, in my case, to be wrong where I'm wrong, but just being willing to be out there and push a different narrative out there. I can't tell you how encouraging it's been for me to have so many people say, maybe I don't agree with you, but I'm glad you're doing it. But I've had lots of people saying, I've been wondering about all this. Is it really just these two extremes? And so there's a lot of people out here who are thinking similarly.
Yes. Yeah, you definitely opened my eyes in a whole different light that I've been thinking because I was, going down the dark tunnel with everyone else.
It's
um,
a helpless feeling. It really is a helpless feeling.
yes. So I was like, okay, what vacations do I need to get in before that island no longer exists? that's
Right. What a
that's how I
terrible
was
thought
looking
that,
at
I
it.
mean,
That's yeah, I know. That's how I was looking at it. I was like, where let me make that bucket list now.
yeah.
Yes. Yes, so that's what I was thinking. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Cortez, for your time and insight. To learn more about Mark and his book, Climate Maturity, go to climatematurity.com. If you have a passion for an underserved community, a social justice problem, or want to change minds, contact Project Good Work at projectgood.org to start your project of change today. We'd like to send our deepest gratitude to our ongoing show supporter, Blair Chapman. Subscribe to our mailing list at projectgood.org/subscribe to get our episodes and blog articles sent to you each month, plus get a 10% discount on any project you start at projectgood.org. Also, register to join us on our Changemaker Conference on May 25th at changemakerconference.com. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to Project Good, where we're focused on what matters.